Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 1, Chapter 6 of his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is engaging in some very interesting and important criticisms of Plato and the Platonists. And remember, he's only one generation removed from Plato himself, with whom he studied, and is an interlocutor with the contemporary Platonists, who are a school literally right across town from him. And so he is departing considerably from the Platonic understanding of goods and good, and in a certain respect, in that way, from their ethics. It's also worth pointing out, too, a little side note that he makes. He says that, we have a friendship with the authors of the theory of ideas, but perhaps it would appear desirable and obligatory, especially for a philosopher, to sacrifice even one's closest personal ties, this friendship, in favor of truth. He thinks that there's something fundamentally off about the Platonic doctrine of the good. So what is he talking about there? I've got a portion of that up here. The Platonic conception, and this holds not just for the good, but for all sorts of other things, not every single thing, but all sorts of things. They say that there's a form or idea. They express it, sometimes using one word, sometimes another, sometimes they say the thing itself, in which all of the things of that class participate. So, there's a form, for example, of human being. And I would be just a copy of that form. You would be another copy of that form. We're not the reality itself. The reality is the form in which we somehow participate, we're modeled after. Participation is a complex thing as well, and we're not going to get too deep into that. Aristotle says that the originators of this theory postulated ideas of groups of things in which they posited an order of priority and posteriority. That means that the thing that we look at, the existing thing, like book, is in certain respects later or posterior or dependent upon the archetype, the ideal book. So Aristotle is going to point out a number of problems with this theory as applied to the good. I put little, sort of blurbs about them here. You'd want to actually go to the text and look at each of them to see the full discussion. So the first thing that he says is he brings up this notion of categories. And this is something I'm doing another video about that you can take a look at, where we'll go into a little bit more discussion about it. A category is a fundamental way of saying something about something. So for example, when you're talking about the nature of the thing itself, that is the category of what we call substance. So to say, man is a rational animal, or human being is rational animal, however you want to put it. Anthropos is we translate it either way. There you're signifying the substance. You're saying something about it as that kind of substance. Other categories would include saying tall, right? That is a quality. Or actually, it's not even a quality, that's a quantity that I have. That's a different category. That's in what Aristotle calls the realm of accidents. There's a lot involved there. I don't want to get too deep into that. What's the upshot of this? Well, since the good is spoken of in many different ways, that makes it seem unlikely that there could be one single overarching idea of good that thereby encompasses all of the things that we call good. If there were only one single thing, we wouldn't expect to have all these different categories, all these different modes of talking about goodness. It seems hard to bring them all together under one concept. He also says, this is following up on this, that things that are under a single idea or form should be under a single discipline, or if you like, science or art. Just make sure you understand science to be something different than what we nowadays call science, which is in certain ways a bit more restricted and also a bit more expansive, but doesn't include everything that Plato or Aristotle would call the sciences. The long and short of this is that Aristotle is saying, if there really was one single idea of good, there should be only one discipline that treats of it, because it could encompass everything that falls under that idea. Instead, what do we find out? He says that there are a number of sciences. For example, if we think about the good of opportunity, in war, opportunity comes under the science of strategy. In disease, under that of medicine. The due amount in diet, that's a good thing. The metrion comes under medicine. In bodily exercise, under gymnastics. And we could expand this more and more and more. So the good is dealt with by multiple disciplines or arts or sciences. And therefore, it's not one single unified thing, the way that Plato is saying. Then he brings up a metaphysical objection, one that also has to do with knowledge. The problem of the third man, he doesn't bring it up as under that name. That's something that later on people will ascribe to it. But this is a famous argument against Plato's forms. And the way that it runs is like this. You say, okay, here's a man, here's a human being. Now there's some sort of, idea out there floating around, or maybe in a different world, or who knows where, human being, and I in some way participate in it. I'm a copy of that idea, however we conceive of that. Now, how do we know that I am actually a copy of that? How do we relate me to that archetype? We have to do so with what is common to both of us. But wait a second, that thing is supposed to be what is common to all human beings. And so now there is a third, there's where the third man comes in, a third perhaps form or something like that, that is the archetype for both the archetype and myself. And if we can do it once like that, then we can still ask another question and go on to infinity. And the Greeks did not like infinity, so they thought that was a bad idea. But this would be a bad idea anyway. Aristotle's not exactly saying precisely that. Instead, what he's saying in terms of ideal man and man here, he says, insofar as both are human being, there's no difference. If so, no more will there be any difference between the ideal good and good insofar as they're good. If they both have the same definition, then look, either the definition is a third thing, in which we better be looking at that definition rather than thinking about an idea, or they're in effect the same. If they have the same definition, then in that respect they're the same. So the form of the good, or the ideal good, and good, insofar as they are both good, are really the same thing. And he also considers another issue. Plato thought, and a lot of people do think, that those ideals are better in a certain way because they're eternal and they're not time-bound or space-bound. And Aristotle says, why will the ideal good be any more good? Because it's eternal. It's not as if a white thing that lasts a long time is any whiter than a thing that is only white for a day. This is also, by the way, a line of reasoning that Aristotle is not entirely consistent with throughout the rest of his works. But it is an interesting way to attack Plato's idea. Now, he considers a possible objection that the Platonists might make. Here he's being very charitable to them. He's saying, look, they might try to respond to me by saying, this idea of the good isn't supposed to deal with all goods. Let's make a distinction between things that are good in themselves. They're desired for their own sakes, or they're pursued for their own sakes. Things that we recognize as intrinsic goods, and then all those other useful goods over there, right? So what would be examples of intrinsic goods? Aristotle talks, for example, about wisdom. That's something that people do pursue for its own sake. What else does he talk about? Pleasure. Pleasure is something that people do seek for its own sake, at least certain pleasures. Honors. You could, I suppose, seek honors in order to gain something out of it, but many people do, in fact, seek honor because they see it as an intrinsic good. The virtues. Now, what would be, other things? Well, the useful goods that we're going to put over on the side. The problem, as Aristotle points out, is that these goods are not only multiple, which wouldn't be that big of a problem if they could all be brought under one common idea, but they have different irreducible accounts or definitions, or however you want to translate logoi. We have different conceptions of them. Pleasure is not the same thing and is not understood in the same way as is virtue, which is not reducible to wisdom. And none of these are reducible to honor. These are distinct. They are indeed goods, but they are not dealt with according to the same conception, although we still use the word good of them. So they're not falling under one Platonic conception of the good. One of the more interesting objections that Aristotle will make towards the end of this discussion has to do with, you might say, whether there are adopters of this idea. And Plato had suggested that it's important to think about these ideal forms because they are the pattern or the archetype for the created things that we have. And if we want to create other things, like let's say we want to create justice in a human being, it will be to our benefit to look to the archetype of justice rather than to individual instances of justice, because the archetype is the clearer pattern or model which then we can employ as sort of like a blueprint. Now, Aristotle points out a real interesting problem with this in asking, well, if it's so useful, then why don't we see people in the arts and sciences talking a lot more about the Platonic good? Why don't the disciplines actually discuss it and look to it? So he says, here we go. These all aim at some good and seek to make up their deficiencies, but they don't trouble about a knowledge of the ideal good. It's improbable that all the professors of the arts and sciences should not know it or even seek to discover it. I suppose the Platonists could say, well, this is indeed a discovery on Plato's part. It's only been a generation. Let's see if it will sink in. I think in our time, we could probably say this has become a stronger argument on Aristotle's part. He also goes on and he says, why don't they discuss it? I'll give you a reason. It's really hard to see how, and he gives you the example of a carpenter, for example, or a physician. He says, it's not easy to see how knowing that the same ideal good, the form of the good, will help a weaver or carpenter in the practice of his craft, or how anyone will be a better physician or general for having contemplated this idea. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't study ethics or think about the nature of the good. But Aristotle is, in essence, saying the Platonic way of approaching this doesn't seem to be particularly helpful or useful in doing ethics or in thinking about other fields in which the good is motivating people.